dance like a monkey. Move like a monkey. Shoot like a monkey. Kill like a monkey. Dance like a monkey. Move like a monkey. Shoot like a monkey. Kill like a monkey.
All right. Good evening, everyone. How are we doing this tonight?
Everyone?
Let's see. How are you doing tonight, Hetman?
I'm doing well. Let me just state this. I know that everybody is coming here, expecting a very heated debate. And
Yeah, that's probably not going to happen.
The thing is they're going to be a little bit surprised because I'm coming at this really not as someone who is a crazed proponent of the Second Amendment. I want to state just, prior to us starting, that I'm aware of all of the terrible costs that have come with this freedom that we are allowed here in this country. And I don't want to make any illusions that, increasingly we are seeing the consequences of gun culture in the United States and of the availability of weapons that are able to in the wrong hands create massive harm. So I just want to state first and foremost that I'm a proponent, but I'm coming at it as someone very much aware of the issues with it. And I think I want to discuss with Daedalus more, I guess, the history of it. Because Daedalus, you can certainly argue, which I'm sure you're going to do, that the Second Amendment, when it was written, had a fully different intent than what was picked up, and that what it's basically used for now.
Well,
go ahead.
Before we kind of veer off into opening statements, I just want to point out that this is going to be kind of different for us. This is kind of us doing live, what we used to do very commonly on our own, sitting in coffee shops and random places in Illinois. So I think this is going to be fun. Not really going to be I don't think it's going to be a traditional blood sports event. So I'm sorry.
No, not at all.
Up front. What it is going to be, I think, is a good window into how me and Hetman came to be as people and as scholars, like kind of the process we go through and all that. Yeah, let me move up a little. I am leaning back tonight, tired. The idea, I think, is to kind of get at this prospect and talk about it a bit. And like, I think I'm kind of familiar with the road you're going to go down. I don't think you're familiar with the road I'm going to go down. So I don't suspect.
Oh, I'm definitely familiar. Yeah,
I
definitely.
don't suspect that you're going to be. I don't suspect anyone to be surprised tonight. So how I want to start this, I think, is to let you lay out the basic outline of your position first. And like, let's take maybe 3 or 4 minutes to do that, and then I'll do the same for mine, and then we will go from there.
That sounds like a good idea. So my position as a proponent of the Second Amendment comes largely from my background as a genocide scholar. I want to also state that I, as well as Daedalus, I don't know if he's okay with me mentioning this, but both of us were raised in families that owned firearms. So we had a background with them. I would say growing up, something that a lot of Americans are familiar with. Probably some of you who are listening can relate to us. Especially where we grew up in Illinois, it's almost semi-rural, and it's not uncommon.
It's not semi-rural, it's rural.
Yeah, I would say very rural. It's the most rural you can get in the Chicagoland metropolitan area. And it's not at all uncommon for people in the area that we grew up to hunt or own weapons. And, that's a background that both of us come from. We share it. So I did come, I grew up, with a household with a parent that owned firearms. I was, taught firearm safety very early in my life. And it's something that, I think having that background makes me relate to the question of firearms ownership in a little bit different of a way than many of my colleagues. I would say that the vast majority of my colleagues in, history or genocide studies, they actually are not of the same opinion as I am. There are a few outliers that certainly are. But anyway, my argument, should I get into my argument, or, should I state a little bit more about, where I'm coming from? I think that, it's pretty self-explanatory. It is my view that, firearms as a defensive tool, they are a means of prolonging survival. There is also a trend that we do see, and I can name several instances. The most recent and poignant, I think I can bring up off the top of my head, is actually the example of the Darfur genocide, where you have basically asymmetric groups loosely affiliated with the state. On their appearance, attacking another one.
Well,
and they're doing this.
Let's not go too far ahead.
Okay.
I think it's as good an introduction as any. You're not wrong. We both come from a background where firearms were in the home, and here's the thing: I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. In fact, in and of itself, I don't think it's a bad thing at all. The issue that I have always drawn is one of intent, and a discussion of this intent and where it comes from in the Constitution, and whether these things can be regulated, and kind of what happened in our country to change how we saw the Second Amendment. So my position would be that the Constitution always created the Second Amendment the framers created the Second Amendment for an incredibly specific purpose, and that purpose was to facilitate the creation of a militia instead of an army. And that the states always claimed the right to regulate that militia and to appoint its officers. And this has never been a power that you can grant onto an individual. Whether it is to form a militia or to own a firearm is not a constitutional right. It is a right enshrined in our common laws between the United Kingdom and America, but it is not a constitutional right in and of itself. And to treat it as such, for the reasons it is commonly cited, of having a guard against the government in this day and age especially, is absolutely insane. And that's setting aside the absolute scourge of gun violence that has happened in the United States, which can only really be the result of Avery, go lay down. You just had food. Enough. Which can only really be the result of the fact that half of all the small arms in private ownership in the world are here in America. And that the simple reality is more guns is going to mean more gun violence. And to try to argue that you cannot take any steps to try to curb this is to me, and to base it off the Constitution is to me categorically incorrect.
I think that I don't know, how do I put it? The origins of the Second Amendment and all, like what it became, and particularly now the problem that you have with, a large proliferation of guns in this country. How do you, the question of how do you regulate it? How do you, fix the problem now? They're almost two separate issues.
Absolutely.
And both are extremely both are extremely, I mean, the latter is extremely difficult, to I don't disagree with you. I think that some plan, should be implemented, but I am absolutely at a loss of how you do this. I've heard people, that are very like friends of mine, for example, and like colleagues who are really, really, unfamiliar with gun culture in the United States. I mean, guns just generally scare them. They've brought up examples, for example, like Australia, how they, reined in, their problem with handguns, for example, with buyback programs. And I feel like such programs, even if they're implemented, they'll yield very little success, because I think that the mentality is in place in the United States. Like you have to fight the mentality first and foremost. And that's very difficult to do. That's like, I think.
Yeah, I think that's
your
in and of
biggest
itself a separate issue, and like we can talk about that as we go on. But I think the first place to start is the Second Amendment itself. So I'm going to bring it up. This is the Constitution, not the Bill of Rights. That's my fault. Bill of Rights. I'm going to bring it up and read it, and I'm going to then run for a little bit, and you can yell. All right, Amendment 2. A well-regulated militia, comma, being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, comma, shall not be infringed. This is a really awkward sentence, by the way. Like, very awkward.
It's not really clearly defined. Like, not, I mean, it's clear, but, it's not like something that, like, I think it's very much,
The problem is you have an interrupter here being necessary to the security of a free state. And this part of, like, the amendment is doing two things. The amendment is establishing that we need to have a militia, and is saying that the militia is vital to the security of the state. And, like, that's already kind of awkwardly worded. But the problem is that there is parts of it, the thought that is being presented in the Bill of Rights, that are just not there. You don't find out how the framers are feeling about this particular reason, why they're doing this, unless you consult the Federalist Papers. Because they talk at length about the militia in the Federalist Papers, and I actually have the page marked here for tonight, because it's pretty much the capstone of my argument. But the point is that, like, this is now unclear, and it's very short. And I'll be honest, this is also a very long tradition in American law about not necessarily being as clear as we should about the rights, the responsibilities, and the organization of the defense of the nation, and how that works. And then this second part, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, would seem to be very clear on its own, but it's sitting there in this sentence that's not very clear. So,
yeah,
this is also, like, we talk a lot about history here, obviously. This is contextual to the time, too, right? The understanding of the creation of the amendment is not the same today, because we have changed the entire method about how we go about raising an army to defend ourselves. And we had changed it fairly quickly, even after the amendment was written. So, at the risk of I'm going to bring up the chart again, the 5 C's, change over time. That first one right there is really important in this context. And I think it's telling that the expectation of the people, particularly when you consider in the Constitution that, at least as written when it was written, that the greater majority of the people don't actually vote in this system. They aren't allowed to participate, but they are allowed to participate in the defense of the nation and expected to be a piece of that. The expectation of responsibility here is really borne out by the concept of the militia and what the expectation of what the militia is. And the argument that I see people making in a modern context is that the militia is the whole body of the people, that anyone can be called up to defend at any time, which is a very, very classical notion, I think. Like a very classical Greek notion, in fact, of who is responsible for defending the polis. But it's not a modern notion. We have a series of federal legislation that's usually called the Militia Acts that help define the powers of the militia of the president with regards to the militia and who the militia is. One of them, the one in 1903, establishes the National Guard, which becomes the militia, and that's that. Like, there's the militia, it gets federal funding, it has to follow certain guidelines, it's well regulated. Like, the intent was never to let a bunch of people run around willy-nilly with guns and be and be and be an independent militia, like outside of any control.
I guess, like, the thing that I always think, when people go all the way back to the amendment and what the intent of it actually was is, all of that right now is past. We're already way past the point of
Of a
I hate to
militia
say it,
being a
no
viable
return.
a
Well,
viable
of
defense,
a
first of all.
militia, yeah, of course, but I'm not even referring to that. I'm referring to, what it was intended for and how it was interpreted over time and what it is now. And we're past the point of a return. I am, not optimistic that you can solve this issue. I think it's probably
I'm not sure it's unsolvable. I think the principal problem is uh, perceptional. Um, and stepping aside from gun violence, like the idea, and this is going to kind of run into your argument, I think, a little bit. The idea that the individual ownership of to be fairly blunt, a limited means of defense, such as small arms, is a sufficient check on the tyranny of a government with the firepower of the United States is absolutely insane. Um,
This is where we can have a debate a little bit about,
and more to the point,
yeah.
the circumstances under which I think this kind of effort would be successful. I would have specified the people that keep and bear arms rather than the nation. The people are the nation, though, in the mindset of the framers of the Constitution. Popular sovereignty means that the people, like, it gets back to what we talked about last week. What the Constitution starts out with, we the people, making the argument of who the sovereign power is. It's not an individual right, it's a right of the sovereign itself. The people are the sovereign power. And it's, frankly, they very quickly build a system, but at the time it's written, they do not have a system in place to centralize a militia outside of like meeting up in the town square and marching off to battle. We build armories in the United States very quickly and store weapons there for the use by local militias and the federal government when necessary. It's a different concept. Sorry, I got sidetracked by chat. But still, the the argument that Hetman wants to have is that having these weapons available to the population at large is a guard against disaster. Is that correct?
I think in the it's such a hard topic to tackle. It's so fraught. It I feel like, so for example, that it has both benefits and of course enormous costs. And at this point in my life, I'm unsure if those benefits outweigh the costs. I believe that, and I know, for a fact, as a scholar, as a genocide scholar, that, being armed, having the ability to organize, resistance groups, which start, by the way, they start with, of course, small arms, and if you can find funding or aid from something else, they grow. But yeah, it's a really difficult question to address. It honestly, it's something that I think so. So here's a position that you do take, Daedalus. So okay, the U.S. Army has tanks. The power of the sovereign. The sovereign has tanks. They have a navy. They have an air force. But
Air Force, helicopters.
but that's assuming. This is assuming that in the event of a full-scale civil war, which we don't know what that would look like. Of course, what if Altus gives us really great examples, of what something like that might look like. But
that's sarcasm.
Yeah, I really had to take that shot. But we have no idea, what that'll look like, what that would look like. But I have sincere doubts, knowing what I know about, the demographic composition of the country, the political demographics, all of that it would look something akin to the U.S. Army having a monopoly of the power, and because you have people when civil wars erupt, when these things happen, you have people who defect from the army. They bring their weapons with them. You have people,
let's name it
interest groups.
We're talking about the defection of military officers and personnel and their equipment,
which is inevitably would happen in a scenario like this. Like assuming that the military would wantingly, in its entirety, carry out atrocities against the civilian population or certain groups, segments of the population. I think that's it's not to say that something like that couldn't happen, because it does, but it's a tall order. I especially think so in the American context.
Yeah, I think before anything, like the historical expectation would be that a politically divided army, divides. The problem, I think, isn't though that the problem with this scenario, and for example, the scenario posited by What If Altus, is he believes that the vast majority of the country is very sharply divided. And most people think the country is very sharply divided. The reality is that for the regular everyday person and for the soldier, the regular everyday soldier in America, the level of what would have to happen to even get to that point, we're still very far off. So it's very difficult to say right now uh, that people are going to line up to start a civil war. That seems unlikely.
No, civil wars don't start that way. There's usually, a build-up period. They don't suddenly
And
break up.
We don't really see
formed.
any of the pre-indicators right now.
No, we don't, and we didn't. Even when there were people talking about it during the late Trump presidency of like the possibility of something like that. I always I found like such statements rather absurd, honestly, and I think that it's a very remote at this point possibility. But things change. You would definitely see the signs of change coming.
Yeah, you know it well before it got here.
Yeah, it would not erupt suddenly, and that's like the thing. I think people have the perception. They look at, for example, like what had happened in Syria or some other country. They see it on the news, and people just think that these conflicts. Your average person just thinks that these conflicts erupt out of nowhere, and often they're fueled by decades, if not at times centuries of issues, and they're also about resources. They're not. It's not a.
Civil wars are.
There's never a simple cause of a civil war. Let's just put it that way.
And they're also a lot more economic than they tend to be ideological too. Like take the American Civil War is very much an issue of economy in the South when they're talking about the preservation of slavery. So there's a lot of misconceptions that happen, particularly because for most Americans, these conflicts kind of come up out of nowhere, at least relatively speaking to their perception. The kind of thing I think we're looking at that's likely is in this situation isn't the mass defection of an army or a civil war. It's a localized insurrection of a bunch of people who's formed one of these illegal militias, and they decide, for example, to take over a wildlife refuge. As happened in the Obama years at the Mahler Wildlife Refuge. Like what we're looking at is more akin to people enacting acts of terrorism in fairly isolated cells, as opposed to a large-scale situation like this. And in this context, the primacy is ultimately going to remain with the government.
In these contexts, for sure. I think that...
And that's the most likely scenario that we're looking at for the foreseeable future.
I think that the worst case scenario, so that's the most likely scenario. Worst case scenario is that you see something either localized or, widespread. You see something similar, maybe akin to the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And if you were to look at proportionally the damage that a conflict like that could cause, it's not insignificant. It's pretty terrible. But I think that's a really unlikely scenario. But I think it's a possible one.
Here there's 2 points to that scenario I think is important. The first is that at that point that something like the Troubles emerges in the United States, for at least that portion of the country where it emerges, that localized area, the Constitution is now moot anyway, and so is most of the rest of law and order. The second thing is, in the case of a civil war where you have mass defections, you with your extra rifle are somewhat irrelevant anyway. To the actual power, to the actual power of either side, firepower wise. It's not like there's a shortage of weapons sitting in the United States for the military to utilize, and like a civil war like that probably starts to look like the Russian Civil War very quickly, with two sides press ganging civilians into the conflict, etc.
Also roaming bands too,
of soldiers,
Yeah.
Ordering, and like at that point, again, everything we're talking about in terms of law and American tradition is done. There is no going back to it either. It's over. That is the end at that point. Like in that
Argument.
particular case.
Mhm. My argument would be in that scenario, that very, very worst case scenario, firearms, particularly the higher end of what civilians are allowed to possess, have the privilege, so to speak, of possessing, they can help with survival. They can help prolong it. They can even, you know, ensure survival in some instances, and not even isolated incidences for the duration of the conflict. That said, though, we're talking about hypothetical situations, and the likelihood of that worst case scenario. I brought up my personal, like, in terms of likely scenarios, the worst one. I brought up, like a trouble style, limited, or
But what you're
somewhat,
ultimately talking
fairly
about,
widespread
what you're ultimately talking
conflict.
about in this particular case is a society that's functionally collapsing, collapsed, or on the verge of. And in this
Kind of
case,
like what we saw in Syria, what you see in the Russian Civil War, what you saw in Yugoslavia, for example. That is to me, what would be a worst case scenario. And yeah, that's basically
there are a lot of
um,
assumptions based into
the collapse of law and order in large sections of the United States.
yeah, and to bake in the efficacy of a firearm and survival, I don't disagree that it would be effective. I don't think you're gonna. It's also not the only method that's effective. Um, Bows relatively easy to make, suffice for hunting in most cases. The thing about firearms and the reality of it we're talking about at this point is that more often than not, people are envisioning the scenario and envisioning being one of the roving gangs of assholes when they think about guns, which isn't realistic.
Especially on the right, especially with like some of the biggest proponents,
Yeah,
like
you're
the
looking at
NRA members. But
really what you're looking at too in terms of survival skills is going to be farming and metalwork and pharmacology and like a lot of very basic things that require communities to be formed
first aid, yeah.
that preclude and their weapons are valuable to defend that community. And I don't disagree, but again, we're talking very far off in a hypothetical. The problem I have is the here and now. Uh,
Here's also an issue too, and it's also another point of why I am a proponent of the Second Amendment. You know, um, my belief is that in a country that has the problem with gun violence that we do, that has a problem that is not unlikely to go away in the immediate future, I would rather have that means to protect myself. I'm not even talking about, against the government here, or against like,
yeah, I'm gonna tear this
like
apart. So be careful.
I know you're going to try to tear it apart, but like, I think that the truth stands that, if I would rather have the ability to own a concealed handgun, or to own at the very least, a scattergun, a shotgun of some sort to protect my home and my family. I'd like to be able to own as I said before, just now, a concealable handgun to be able to protect myself when I am out.
Okay.
Because now, like, I mean, it's the reality of where we live. And I think, too, added to this, the issue of mass shootings is not going to go away soon.
All right.
And if I was in that scenario, I would like to have a means of defense.
Okay.
rather than no means at all. So go ahead.
Let's take two of these situations at a time. Let's start with out and about and carrying a concealed handgun. I am not entirely certain that the proliferation of weapons isn't what makes that situation in the first place. Uh, but that's a different problem. Here's problem the first. Problem the first is the chance that you will survive a firefight has very little to do with having a gun. It has everything to do with your ability to
Cover?
find and seek effective cover, to
Yeah.
escape danger. The concept that you need to have a gun and that you for some reason don't have to retreat is silly macho nonsense. You absolutely can, and
And
will survive
that I
better
agree with
and
you. Yeah.
longer if you do not engage in a fight. So for 99% of the situations, the concealed carry permit guy is probably on the verge, if they're very unlucky, of making things worse.
I think that, I mean, can I respond to that, please?
Sure.
That is something that I think most people who go through the courses of concealed carry, that is something that they're aware of, that they're taught. For example, it's and especially now, there's more education about it than ever, of when do you use a firearm, when do you pull it out, what is, like, how do you legally go about doing it, like legal use of force, for example. Which I mean is problematic, because in certain places, like,
yes,
that have stand your ground laws. I mean, it's
there's two huge issues that there are a lot of places in which the permissiveness of use of force laws has become absolutely absurd. The other half of this particular equation is that even in those particular cases, the idea, like stand your ground laws notwithstanding, you are now engaging in the extra legal. You are now engaging in acting as an executioner for the state. In this particular case, the person who's committing the crime is being denied their rights to trial and due process by a bunch of civilians running around
Thank you,
shooting
Lauren.
at them. The ideal situation is to have that person surrender or to give up. Like the fact that we leap to violence and seem to feel justified in it is a disturbing trend.
Oftentimes, in those situations, in for example, in states that have stand your ground laws, I would say the vast majority, or at least 60% of cases where force is used, I think that in most of those cases, other skills, like, conflict resolution with, like, de-escalation, would certainly help, would have probably actually alleviated, if not alleviated, the situation entirely. Violence, criminal violence, and well, let me say it before I get ahead of myself. But usually, criminal violence comes, when you're not prepared for it, or when you're not expecting it.
No, let's talk about this because it's really important in this particular context. Most of the criminal violence that involves things like murder are about people who
who know each other,
and they're intimate partners, and it's a problem of misogyny and societal expectations. The dream of the random shooter coming out, like obviously we see those things viscerally when they occur, but for most people who are murdered by a gun, they're being murdered by their partner. So in that case, and they're being murdered by weapons that are purchased legally. In that case, the ownership of the guns is the problem that helps push that along. It makes it possible.
Daedalus, may I ask you something?
Go for it.
So, in regards to, you were right when you bring up the fact that the vast majority of murder victims know their killer. You brought up the example domestic violence now. Do you have any solid evidence? Did you bring any to the table of, domestic violence victims making up the majority of gun crime victims? in a
No,
given year
because
in the United States.
that's not necessarily the case. The majority of, because again, suicide is included in crime stats, and
Yeah.
that is the vast majority of gun deaths. In fact, the number hovers year to year around 30,000 ish, give or take 27, 28, 29. The two-thirds
Suicides.
of that is suicides. Overwhelmingly, the vast majority of that is a question of a complex question of availability of means. Again, which is, I think, a similar problem to domestic violence, because the means of harm is there, therefore they occur.
The
And
means of harm. Okay, go ahead.
to
Sorry.
be clear, in the vast majority of domestic violence, at least as my understanding of the stats, the vast majority of victims of domestic violence are not necessarily firearm victims. They might be knives, biles, etc., other means of causing harm. But the problem is there, and it is enhanced by the presence of the firearm.
Okay, so you made that point. What about, for example, in the other case, and I think that this also illustrates it. The vast majority of people, who are victims of, violence by firearms, being people who know each other but have a conflict with each other. I'm talking like, say, gang violence or things of that nature. Would having the availability to kill someone fast, and effectively, that ability that a firearm gives you. I mean, there's other ways
There is,
in which you can enact this violence.
I feel like in the context of gang violence is a different, like, we're talking a different level at that point, right? Because a gang is, well, it's a gang, to be perfectly blunt. They're going to find access to violence in one way or the other that they want. The gun, and the gun fuels the conflict. But that's also oftentimes trafficked weapons, etc., and things like that, where we're kind of already, like, they're already beyond what we're talking about in terms of law and the system and what is being permitted by it.
Okay.
So, for example, like a gang member having a gun is oftentimes going to be in violation of well,
Gun
kind
law
of court
of any
ruling.
established gun. Yeah, of course.
Might, because a lot of gang members get pinched all the time, right? And they get sentences and they get rules and they go and break those rules and etc. And like that's an entirely different process and problem that is not is very much a economic issue, and making gangs not economically viable is how you address that. The problem that we're kind of talking about is, does our understanding of the Second Amendment and its permissiveness of gun culture create these more less NCIS law and order type situations, and more the kind of everyday things that, for example, women are cautioned about all the time, of having to deal with violent partners. Like that's, I think, where we have to focus this discussion, because the intimate partner murdering that happens isn't really going to be stemmed, and doesn't really overlap with gang violence in a reasonable way.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to really look at the numbers of what percentage of murder victims are victims of domestic violence, how many of those murders involve a firearm, and how they stack up with other, murder of other causes. Like, I'd like to look at the FBI statistics on it.
Well,
we probably should have.
I have in the
either
past.
You or I should have prepared. I have too, but it's been a really long time, and
Well, I think it's in this particular case worth talking about a kind of flaw in crime reporting statistics, We do not have uniform standards across the country.
100%.
It is
Sweet
very
as a guitar.
patchwork. It's very difficult to draw reasonable conclusions from those numbers, because what is this? I actually just plugged that into Google to see what's happening. 1 out of 5 murder victims were killed by an intimate partner. That's total, not necessarily gun violence. So 1 out of 5 is not insignificant.
No, that's a lot. Yeah, that is a lot.
62% were wives, common law wives, ex-wives, or girlfriends, basically women. Men can be victims of intimate partner homicide. 4.9% of men are murdered by a partner. Oh. This is not going to give me information on the means or methods, but this is VAW.net, project for the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. There's
Incredible source.
There's Bureau of Justice Statistics for last year, which isn't nearly as helpful for me in this particular case. The United Nations has reports overall the world over, which is really depressing when we start looking at the Middle East, Africa, and the rest of Asia.
Yeah.
Some 47,000 women and girls worldwide were killed by their intimate partner or other family members in 2020. This is the United Nations.
I'd say that's a
office.
conservative. That's probably a conservative statistic too. I'm sure that the real number is a lot higher.
I'm afraid it probably is in this particular case because, like I said, even here in the United States, the number would be conservative. We don't have reporting requirements. We have Congress has outlawed the studying of gun violence functionally in this country. So it's very difficult to draw a lot of it's very difficult to put a stamp on a set of conclusions here that say, well, the science backs this up. Science isn't there because it's not allowed to occur, which I think is telling in and of itself.
Wait, when has such studies been banned? I'm curious.
Oh, it's been some time. Let me pull it up. It's been a while. It would be after the 1970s because that's kind of where all this went into effect. The NRA is not a... Why is I'm not getting the thing? No, that's not the thing I typed. Screw you, Google. Google's not helping. Oh, yeah, here it goes. CDC funding of gun violence research assigned at 96% after the passing of the Dickey Amendment. 1997.
So who's the dick who made the Dickey Amendment?
Dickey and Wicker. Jay Dickey, a Republican member of the United States House of Representatives from Arkansas. No one is particularly inclined to be surprised there. Although the Dickey Amendment did not explicitly ban it, basically the CDC gets punished if the results of the study advocate or promote gun control. So because they think the most likely outcome is that if they study these phenomena, it's going to say we should have fewer guns in society, and they're going to get fined for it, they don't do it. It functionally bans the study of gun violence. Because basically we allowed ourselves to have an amendment in place on a bill that says that the outcome of the study is illegal.
Interesting. I thought I've read various. I mean, I've read studies by various institutions like University of Chicago. Various studies
doing their best without real funding for it.
Yeah. Yeah, that actually surprises me. So now that I think of it, yeah, when the FBI does a general study, it's not something usually connected with just firearms death. It's usually broader than that.
Yeah, and
from what I remember.
the thing I have about crime numbers overall in the country is that the effectiveness of law enforcement is very difficult to track without a unified reporting.
Yeah.
Without a unified reporting requirements, right? However, the data we do have is like really grim about the efficacy of law enforcement. Um, and this is getting a little bit away. If like basically, if you commit a crime in the United States, you have a 50-50 chance of getting away with it. Oh, I see chat is going on its own debate for a little bit too. However, not all gun deaths are premeditated. Very true. And yes, we're making an excellent point here about the storage of weapons that I think Hetman would be. Most the idea is that you, as a responsible gun owner, are keeping your gun locked away in a safe or in a lockbox or some scenario where you don't have it available all the time because weapons hanging out willy-nilly is ill-advised. Because that's a good way to get shot.
Or it's a good way of someone,
And that kind of brings me to the other half of your particular equation of personal defense. Home invasion, right?
Of course.
Here is my issue. Most cases of home invasion aren't directly to harm the homeowner. It's a highly risky thing to do.
Okay. Let me address that real quick. All right. The person who owns the gun is equally responsible to, receive proper education and training on how to use one. I think that the fact that is not done, like, a person can just, buy a gun without that is absolutely absurd. Everybody should have to be able to take a class, learn about scenarios like that so that they're prepared to use them. Nobody that I know who's a responsible gun owner or someone who actually takes, owning it seriously, as serious as it should be, because it's a tool that can kill you. It's designed to create harm. Not one of them that I know has not had a responsible approach to these scenarios. People get killed all the time because of the lack of education.
Yes.
They get killed, for example, because, 99 times out of 10, when you have someone, in the middle of the night, knocking, banging at your door, it's not usually a person trying to break into your house.
Yes, because
it's usually for whatever reason the police. Yeah.
Well, behold, Thor, God of Thunder, is trying to infiltrate my house. No, but yeah, that's the other half of it, though. Like, a person's not trying to get into kill you. The other half of the particular equation is, do I really want to shoot someone who's probably there to steal my TV? Answer should be no. But a lot of situations you see all the time in the news, someone pulls into a driveway to turn around, and a homeowner comes out firing. You see people going, yeah, he walked into my house. I don't know what he was doing there. I opened fire. Not great. That's executing someone over stealing a TV seems extreme to me. And in a case where someone is accessing, trying to get into the building to kill you, they've probably got a plan and are going to succeed whether you've got a gun or not. I'm going to be perfectly blunt. Like, if you've pissed someone off to the point that they are trying to break into your house to kill you, they've moved well past the stage of incidental, I'm at heat of the moment. They've moved into premeditated and probably at least have, some concrete idea of what they're doing.
I think that that's a really flawed assumption. That's assuming that everybody who is, for example, going to implement such a plan has the intelligence to carry it out,
maybe
has the skill set. A lot of times when you look at criminals, armed criminals, armed home invasion robberies, they're usually from people who are, piss poor protoplasm. I'm sorry to say that. They're not very bright individuals. and they do it sort of, it's not really done, it's not usually thought out very well. You can actually look up a lot of these videos. So
most home invasion robberies aren't someone trying to kill you. If they're carrying a weapon, they're usually carrying it because of the prospect of the homeowner might.
Most of those people are so. Look, it might not be their intent originally to come in to kill you, but a lot of people get killed anyway. You're giving these people who decide to do that way too much agency. A lot of time they act impulsively because they're even less, we're talking about people, for example, like say someone who legally bought a gun and, accidentally shoots their son, when he comes in the middle of the night. That same level of stupidity is usually, with these type of people who commit home invasion robberies. That's the truth of it. And a lot of times they do not care when they kill someone anyway. So on your end, I would gladly take out someone like that. Like, if I was in that situation, I would gladly defend myself.
Yeah, but now again, you're that's not the issue. The issue isn't their intelligence. The issue is what set of circumstances lead them to think they need to be armed. And if that set of circumstances isn't there, would they still? And no. The idea that criminals are too stupid to be aware of the consequence of their actions and to make calculated choices is frankly silly. Kind of like,
not all of them, but that's a large portion of them. There's a big portion of them.
You're veering very close to early 20th century eugenicists' concepts of crime.
How am I?
The idea that they are somehow mentally deficient and that's why they make bad choices. That
isn't
really
the case for all of.
No, that's not a sustainable model in any kind of real sense. The problem with that is that it assumes stop, Avery. The problem with that is that it assumes that the crime is not a function of circumstance; it's a function of some kind of base genetic issue, and that's not. It's very often, it's very often an implication. The problem with that is that people are making conscious choices based around circumstance and material condition. That's not a question of deficiency. It's a question of, the homeowner might have a weapon, therefore I should have a weapon, etc. It's an escalation that's caused by circumstance, not mental deficiency.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not going to disagree with you, that circumstance gives rise to crime. That's I never even stated the argument too that these people are,
but that's implied
it's 100%, it's 100% like
but saying that they don't have agency.
A lot of times, what I'm saying, they have agency, but a lot of times these plans that they come up with, crime, the reason why they're in a life of crime is because of circumstance. It has to do with, their socioeconomic status, their socialization, brutalization that they might have seen growing up. But in the majority, in many, many cases, you're not dealing with people who have a very well thought out plan. And I mean, you can see this when people interview prisoners, just regular prisoners who get caught right away after what they did, some years ago. They wish they never would have done it. It was poorly planned out.
But a poor plan is not.
Put them in the place. A poor plan is a plan.
No plan.
It's not the same thing as no plan, but a lot of times they're really poorly planned out. The people planning them are not well educated. Due to circumstance, and I hate to say it, I'm of the beliefs in some cases due to their it's not any given, but in some cases due to the environment or culture that they're in. So, yeah.
But that's not the same thing as not having a bad plan, though. Like the crux of the argument is that the bad plan.
I don't care if they have a plan or not. If they have the intent I don't care why. Maybe let's think of a scenario. Maybe they saw, I'm living they've been, observing me or saw that I had something that they like and they can't come up with a plan. I don't care how much time they put into it. Let's go and break into this person's dwelling at gunpoint and negotiate with their life and rob them. I mean, at that point, I don't care. One, I'm not going to leave my doors open. In my own scenario, I'm not going to I'm going to hopefully have some, and this goes back to education. It's not just there are many layers of defense and plans that you develop. Of course, you can't prepare for everything. And, when things like this do happen, it's it's a given on whether or not what your level of success is going to be in something like this. But I'd rather have that means to defend myself. If I hear that someone has broken a window, say in the basement of my house, here's the scenario that I would enact. Hopefully I would be sleeping at that point. If I'm not, I would be, usually people who own guns, they have specific places where they put them. They usually have a few, so they're accessible in a scenario like that. And they usually have a safe room where they can, go, usually a part of the house where you can lock the door, you get your gun, you sit in place, you call the police, let them know, the dispatcher know that you're armed, and you take it from there. I mean, that's an ideal scenario, but that's, usually people who are educated and have gone through some sort of course, some sort of firearms education course, some sort of use of force course, they are taught these sort of scenarios and, instances. And I think that's, an issue that's something that needs to be emphasized here is education.
Right.
But that can avoid a tragedy.
But that like in that particular scenario, in that case, there's a very excellent chance, given the dispersion of things that are nice around your house, that the burglar need not ever encounter you and steal a thing and leave. And that would be unfortunate. You've lost things, but no one died. And
in that scenario, let's put it this way. If say, okay, someone saw that a new TV was being delivered to me, and for whatever reason they decide that they're going to want to go in there to burglarize it. They do it, at a point of the night, possibly, or thinking that I'm not home. In that case scenario, I'd much rather them, leave with my TV than get into a gunfight with this individual.
That's my point.
Even if it goes successful for me, even if I kill him, because that's a whole headache after that. Not even just a headache, that's a whole bit of trauma I'm getting to that. That's a whole trauma that I would have had to endure that I didn't necessarily have to endure. But if I'm at a point where, they are a danger to me, to my loved ones, and I have no other means, of course, if someone breaks into my house, I'm not gonna, I'm gonna try to defend myself if they're, have that intent.
Attitude. There are so many people who would in fact shoot you over the TV.
There are, and that goes back to my, what I said about education and mandatory use of force classes.
Yes,
and
is a case of the permissiveness of use of force and the proliferation of firearms.
Of course, and you can make that argument, especially with stand your ground states. But this is why I believe that education, first and foremost, if you're going to have the privilege of owning guns to protect yourself, you have to be educated in lawful use of force.
Okay, but making that contingent upon making ownership of firearms contingent upon that would be ferociously opposed by the NRA and
it's ferociously opposed,
under the
but
under the 2008 or 7, I forget exactly what year, DC versus Hellier interpretation of the Second Amendment.
yeah, no, it's problematic, of course, but I think that that's the best way, to alleviate a lot of the problems that we have. I mean, and why not try to push for something like that? I know that there's a lot of backlash. I'm not sure. I mean, a lot of people, that's the funny thing, is like a lot of people who work for the NRA, they've taken these classes. They've actually are big into that in their personal life.
Yes,
but they don't really advocate that it should be mandatory for people to take a class. You have the right to purchase a firearm. You have to go through the background check, criminal background check. I think all states have that. But, also you have to take this mandatory course. It might be an extra, however amount of money on the lawful use of force. And you also have to take classes to know how to use this gun responsibly. I think that would be immensely beneficial. I mean, this is kind of drifting away from our, debate a little bit.
We have moved from the thing, and there is an opportunity for me to bring it back, though. The thing is,
I like Lauren's attitude. I really do.
Here's my problem ultimately with the Second Amendment is up until the Heller case, we understood that the Second Amendment does not provide an absolute unchallengeable right to firearm ownership, and we passed gun laws, and then we turn around and in one swift stroke, Anton Scalia, through arguing about grammar, struck it down basically.
Can you actually mention this case particularly, because I actually don't. I'm not familiar with it, and it would be very beneficial to me.
District of Columbia versus Heller is a Supreme Court case that happened fairly recently. Let me bring it up so I'm not full of crap. Yeah, 2008 case, District of Columbia versus Heller, in which the Supreme Court concluded the Second Amendment includes a right of individuals to bear arms for self-defense. Washington, D.C. obviously is a city with some not insubstantial crime problems because it is an incredibly stratified city, and therefore it has the socioeconomic problems that would cause crime to be significant among a portion of the population. So Washington, D.C. passed a law banning the ownership of handguns. This was challenged by an individual named Richard Heller, who argued that this was a violation of his Second Amendment rights, and this went all the way up to the U.S. Court of Appeals, and then finally was given writ by the Supreme Court and heard in 2008. The case ended up, the individual circumstances of Richard Heller and are somewhat important to the broader narrative at play here. The broader narrative runs back to the 1970s and a kind of shift. There was a infamous event where the leadership of the NRA was ousted, and a new, more radical group came in, and they said, we want to expand the right to firearm ownership and get rid of regulations on gun ownership. And they began a very long and costly effort to do so, just to challenge these laws, to build the network to do so. And it culminates here. It culminates in the Heller case, which fundamentally changes our understanding of the Second Amendment. And it's kind of like, this is the moment, the kind of crux of my argument. The Second Amendment, in my mind, is obsolete. It's much like the Third Amendment, in that it talks about a set of circumstances and protects you against a set of circumstances that are no longer pertinent in our modern society. And that's kind of where we're at. I mean, we
I mean, I think that our talk has, highlighted to a small degree, the complexity of the problem. I think we actually discussed less of the issue, like it was less of, we didn't have a debate really on the issue of,
we talked about
firearms ownership, but more just
feasibility of firearm ownership as a matter of practically influencing politics more than we did anything else. And then we talked about personal defense. And here's kind of, that's kind of I think sometimes an inevitable problem.
The problem that we have, I think, is it is the proliferation of it's the sheer amount of them that are out there.
Yeah,
I mean, there's so many. We have so many guns. It's not even a problem for us anymore. It's a problem for, like, even now, like, for example, in Haiti, there's, the crisis there. Most of the guns that wind up in Haiti are from the United States. Most of the ones that wind up in Mexico in the hands of cartels are from the United States. I mean, it's a hemisphere-wide problem now. It's also a go ahead.
There is a report that's put out every year called the Small Arms Survey.
I know that. Yeah, I know them.
The results of the Small Arms Survey point out that, and I'm going to take the numbers from 2018 because they're the ones I had to hand immediately. 857 million privately owned firearms in civilian hands worldwide. Approximately half, 390 million, are in the United States. The armed forces of all the worlds, all the armies and all the militaries in the world, only account for 133 million weapons, and police forces are 23 million. The number of weapons owned by Americans alone as private gun owners and no official capacity of military or small arms is nearly 4 times that which is owned by all of the militaries on the face of the planet Earth. And I cannot help but feel that not insubstantial portion of our gun violence problems is a result of this number.
I guess I take a Dr. Strangelove approach to all this, where the problem is already there and we just learn to live with it. Because it's so...
Yeah, but we're not living with it. Approximately 30,000 people a year are dying of it.
Yeah. And it could be worse.
That's one of the darkest things I've ever heard, even by my standards.
It's very dark, but I mean, I'm not lying.
Kids,
look at it.
Dark humor's like food. Not everybody gets it.
I mean, look at it. Look at Brazil, for example. We could be Brazil. We could be where else?
Let's learn to live with dying is a hell of a take, man.
I wonder who won. I'm gonna wait. Oh, 50-50. Oh, hold on. 67%. Looks like I won.
Have you?
I can't even call this like a real debate. I mean, it's a heated discussion for sure. But, for me to debate this would be to deny a problem. And like, I've seen the book, like More Guns, Less Crime. I know how absurd, like, that statement is. Of course, there's when you have wait, let me say something though real quick. My father and I always we'll have discussions about this. And one point that he brings up is that the accessibility to firearms is actually greater in the immediate post-war period because there was so many surplus firearms. So, for example, one could, forget, like for $5 or even less, place a mail order for
an
a Colt.
M1.
An M1, a Colt, and all of that. And America wasn't any less armed necessarily then, but I feel like, and I'm not just going to call it a mental health issue because it's a wide issue. It's a compounded issue. The fact that there's widespread mental health crisis in this country is compounded by the fact that there's so many guns in distribution. So you have to solve. I think you have to look at all of this holistically. I mean. But yeah, I mean,
we must change all of society to avoid gun deaths is probably more accurate, but also a hell of a take. I don't necessarily disagree that we have to do a lot of different things to address this, but you
have to address poverty, you have to address mental health, you have to address proliferation. No one's willing to do any of those. That's the problem. You're not even addressing like the basic factors that lead to crime. You're not addressing poverty, systemic problems.
But now we come to a particular point is...
My point. Can I just state something real quick? Okay, go ahead.
I think the same attitude that leads us to think it's perfectly permissible to shoot people all willy-nilly is the same attitude that leaves us incapable of addressing things like poverty. And it's a very crippling influence that a poisonous brand of conservative thought has had on the American psyche. This kind of concept that we are not responsible for addressing problems as a society and that we somehow should address them as individuals is pervasive in American thought in a lot of ways, and frankly, fucking stupid.
I will say this, though, that I am going to feel a lot more comfortable, once I see some real progress made in terms of giving up my, my own.
Well, that's a not uncommon statement from.
That's a thought a lot of people have.
Or our country. That's a not uncommon thought for countries to have.
If I start to see crime go down, and if I start to see actually, here's another thing, because these two things are debates. Are two conflicting ideas here. So on one hand, you have a reluctance. Say, like, I'm going to use actually Chicago as an example, and Cook County as an example. People talk all the time about the violence problem in Chicago and Cook County, the gun problem. But when guns are used, a slap on the wrist is given because of these progressive policies. And they're not putting these people, giving them the sentence that they need for breaking that law. And many of these people, this is not even a debate anymore. They commit a crime with a gun. They're let out on bail, and then they do it again, and something even more heinous. And that's the stuff that they've been, able to prove. So if you're going to have anti-gun laws, you better enforce them. You better make them strict. And along with this too, though, also comes the criminal justice reform of, making prisons a place where you reform people. So these are two issues that are separate. They're often seen separate, but they're part of the same holistic problem. And let me finish real quick. So if I see real change in that regard, I'll be much, much more likely to go along board with it. If I see demilitarization of the police at the same time, I'll be much, much more likely to go along board with it. But in my view, going back to the very beginning of this talk, I am also afraid of, I don't ever trust a government 100% to ensure my safety. For them to not change, things change. I like the idea of being able to prolong my survival, in a scenario, because in my personal history, I have, cases where people were not able to do that.
Sure.
They were in a totalitarian system where they couldn't do that, and that resulted in their deaths. It was one of their factors, not the only, but it is certainly a factor.
Factors. It like the presence of a firearm doesn't undo what happened in Ukraine and the Holocaust.
No, nothing would undo that, of course, but
and there were people who resisted, and it happened anyway.
Of course.
The other half of this is like the criminal justice reforms are badly needed. That we need to have a system. We have systems where people who steal a fucking roll of cheese, so to speak, are rotting away in prison, and people who access to resources are benefiting from these reforms. And yes, I think it's a problem, but I don't think it's the reason that crime is on the rise. Crime is on the rise because you just got a country out of a pandemic which devastated people that they've never recovered from. Like
and in the case of Chicago, it was on the rise before that.
It was
2016.
It was, yeah. But again, talking about Chicago is fraught for me because Chicago doesn't even hit the top 10 of cities with crime. But it is a very common conservative talking point to talk about Chicago.
Oh, it's a common and conservative talking point, but I mean, the reality is that, the reality is though, that, I mean, you can just look at the statistics in terms of, in Chicago, okay, it doesn't compare, in terms of the overall percentage of crime with St. Louis or Detroit or New Orleans or something like that. But you can look at that still doesn't change the fact that you have, and I think that's looking at the city as a whole. It's not looking at the areas that are plagued by it. I mean, take, for example, Inglewood, like an area with, concentrated poverty and crime as a result of that. I mean, you're looking, so they usually use I forgot, for every 100,000 or something, how many crimes are there, and it's like something like, of course, Inglewood isn't 100,000, but it's something like 45 murders or larger, and it's an astounding rate of violence.
It is.
Almost everybody living there knows someone who's been killed by, has been a victim, not even just like a victim who died of violent crime. Everybody knows someone.
The same point is going to come out that's a result of generations of systemic problems, particularly economic problems for Inglewood, not a question of sentencing and bail laws.
But that's a factor too. That is a factor too, because if you were able to hold people who are violating, who are violent offenders with a gun, it's likely that it would help that situation a bit. It would keep, I don't know.
It would help. It's a very compelling argument from the case of an individual who experiences it. I don't know if that's a compelling argument for the case of the situation in an area like Inglewood overall, because we brought up gang violence is kind of a different story. And let's be frank, that's where this particular problem is coming from. And if you get one gang member, you don't necessarily get them all. Therefore, you have not cut off the font in the cycle of violence.
Sorry, my head hurts a little bit.
Yeah, we probably should bring this to a wrap up.
No, but I wanted to mention one thing. RICO is hardly ever used anymore, and that's something that could be done, and it's really not.
It's
in terms of breaking up. Yeah, it's a difficult thing to prove.
The fact that they got Trump on it is like a fucking miracle. In Georgia, the thing is, it's not that people are not using the tools, it's that the tool is designed for a specific set of circumstances that doesn't necessarily always apply. And both the mob mobs and gangs have experienced RICO problems in the past and have a better understanding of how to insulate the organization from RICO charges than they ever did before. Like we adapt, they adapt too. They're not stupid.
Of course.
But with that, I unless you have anything else of pressing nature, I think we should start to close out.
Let's see who won.
Because we have announcements.
Well, thank you. Thanks to the 44%.
We have some announcements. Some not insubstantially big announcements for the rest of the week. First up, tomorrow I have been talking with Josiah over at Pondering Politics. He is going to be streaming tomorrow and asked if I'll come on to talk about, and I'll post a link for everyone who hasn't met Josiah, to talk about the Constitution and its durability, and whether or not the assumptions that went into the creation of the Constitution, particularly in regards to the appointment of Supreme Court justices and the current protections they enjoy and separations they enjoy from the system, are as advisable as they were when we first formulated the Constitution. It's a big deal. It's going to be exciting. I'll post a link in our Discord. You can check it out. The other thing is, on Friday, Hetman is bringing on a good friend of his, a professor, to talk about the evolution of ethnic and cultural identities in Europe, and why, to kind of expound on what I was talking about with Putin and Tucker Carlson interview, kind of expound on this ridiculousness of the concept of saying that Ukraine isn't a real cultural identity. So we were getting that arranged. We had a phone call about that last night. Big exciting stuff going forward.
So stay tuned and subscribe, please. We're trying to get up to 500 in the next month or two.
Yes. With that, I am going to put up the closing screen.